2,200 men live inside USS Yorktown in June of 1942, and by the time the Battle of Midway ends, most of them have spent 3 straight days almost never seeing the sky. You've heard about the dive bombers, the 4 Japanese carriers lost, the 10 minutes that flipped the Pacific War. Almost nobody talks about the part underneath all of that. The part where 500 men are sealed below an armored deck, in compartments the size of a school bus, with no windows and no way to know if the ship above them is winning. That's the story today, not the battle, the steel box they survived it in. Start with where they sleep, because it explains everything else. A Yorktown-class carrier is built to hold roughly 2,200 officers and men, and every one of them needs a bunk somewhere inside a hull already crammed with boilers, magazines, and 80-plus aircraft. The Navy's answer is racks. Canvas stretched over steel frames, stacked 3 high in rows so tight a big man's shoulders brush the rack above him when he rolls over. You don't get a room, you get about 18 inches of vertical space and a small footlocker underneath for everything you own. Your letters, your spare skivvies, a photograph you don't talk about. Sailors learn to dress in the dark, silently, because 1/3 of the crew is on watch at any given hour, while the other 2/3 try to sleep. And waking 40 men to find your shoes is how you make enemies on a ship you can't leave. Picture yourself as one of them. 19 years old, 6 weeks out of boot camp, and this steel rack is the first bed that's ever fully belonged to you. You'd think you'd love it. You don't. Not yet, because the compartment sits below the waterline, right next to a fire room, and the air down there holds heat the way a held breath holds air. Ventilation exists. It's also losing night after night against a few hundred bodies, oil-fired boilers, and a tropical Pacific summer. Men sleep in their skivvies on top of the blanket instead of under it. Some drag their mattresses topside and sleep out on the steel deck under the stars, gambling on a dry night over another 8 hours breathing recycled, boiler-warmed air. That trade-off never makes it into the official history. It's just what several hundred men do when a compartment turns into an oven with a curfew. There's a joke that runs through every berthing compartment on the ship, the kind that would get you fired anywhere else. Somebody always says the racks are so tight you're basically hot bunking with a stranger's ghost. 3 men and 1 mattress taking turns in shifts, even when nobody's technically sharing. It's not far off. On a fully loaded carrier, there aren't always enough racks to go around, so some of the newest hands do sleep in relays, climbing into a bunk still warm from the man who just climbed out of it. Funny, until you're the one doing it at 2 in the morning, after a watch you'd rather forget, sliding into sheets that smell like somebody else's sweat. Food is next on the ladder, and it's better than you'd expect, which is exactly what makes it sting once it runs out. The Navy actually feeds its sailors well by wartime standards. Real meat when the ship's just left port, bread baked fresh in the ship's own bakery, coffee that never seems to stop moving through the passageways. But well-fed assumes the galley can run its normal rhythm, and once a carrier heads into battle, it can't. General quarters sounds, and half the mess hall crew is now standing at gun mounts or hauling powder bags instead of flipping eggs. And the ship itself may be heeling hard enough in an evasive turn to throw a coffee urn clean across the deck. So during Midway's worst hours, hot chow disappears. What replaces it is sandwiches, whatever a skeleton crew in the galley can slap together and pass hand over hand down a passageway to men who can't leave their stations to come get it. You eat standing at your battle post, sandwich in one hand, powder can or headphones in the other. And you don't complain, because the man wedged in next to you hasn't eaten either. Here's what almost never makes the documentaries. Once General Quarters sounds on a carrier headed into a fight, hundreds of men don't just report to their stations, they live there. Watertight doors get dogged shut behind them, sealed tight so a single torpedo hit can't flood the whole ship, compartment by compartment. That's smart engineering. It's also how a 19-year-old ends up locked into a steel box the size of a garage, 4 decks down for hours at a stretch, with men he barely knows, no windows, and one thin voice tube carrying updates from a bridge he will never see with his own eyes. He knows the ship is under attack because the deck shudders under his boots and the lights flicker every time a near miss slaps the hull. He does not know if that miss was near enough to matter. He finds out the way everyone in that compartment finds out. Somebody climbs down the ladder, and the look on that man's face tells the story before he says a single word. That's the real ladder this kind of story keeps promising and almost never delivers. It isn't the size of the bunk. It isn't even the heat or the smell of a compartment that hasn't been aired out in 3 days, or the sandwich you're eating standing up. Underneath all of it is the not knowing, stacked on top of every other discomfort for as long as the battle runs. Sleep is the next casualty, and by June 6th, 3 days into the fight, it's been rationed harder than anything else on the ship. Under normal war footing, that 1/3 on watch rotation gives a sailor something close to a rhythm. 4 hours on, 8 off. Broken, but real. Battle stations erase that rhythm completely. When Yorktown takes her first bomb hits on June 4th, the men who'd normally be swapping shifts stay exactly where they are, because nobody relieves a gun crew mid-engagement. Some of these sailors are awake for 18, 20 hours straight, running on adrenaline and whatever coffee made it down the passageway before the galley went dark. And when the ship finally goes quiet enough to rest, plenty of them still can't sleep. Not with the taste of cordite still sitting in the back of the throat and the memory of that shudder still living in the legs. Up on the flight deck, life is a different kind of brutal, and it's worth pausing on the contrast because it shapes everything about how the men below deal with their own misery. Aviation gas fumes drift across the deck in the heat. Propellers turning a few feet from a man's head throw a wind that can knock him flat or pull him straight into a spinning blade if he loses his footing for half a second. Which is exactly why flight deck crews wear colour-coded jerseys, so a plane captain can be told apart from a fueler at a glance in the noise and the chaos. The roar up there never really stops during flight operations. Engines turning over, arresting cables snapping taut, deck crews shouting over all of it with hand signals because nobody can hear a word. Compared to that, the men sealed below decks sometimes envy the ones topside. At least they can see the sky. And the ones topside envy the men below. At least they're not one bad step from a propeller. Neither job is the easy one. That's the whole ship in a sentence. Back in your rack, or wedged at your battle station, the sounds never stop either. Just a different set of them. The whine of ventilation fans fighting a losing battle against the heat. The clang of hatches being dogged shut 2 compartments over. Boots on a steel ladder. Someone always coming or going, because a carrier this size runs watches around the clock. And somebody's shift is always starting exactly when somebody else's is ending. You learn to sleep through almost all of it inside of a few weeks. What you never fully learn to sleep through is the general quarters alarm. A klaxon that yanks you out of whatever exhausted half-sleep you'd managed, and every single time, for one confused half-second, your body doesn't know if this is a drill. Hygiene barely survives the ladder either. Fresh water on a 1942 carrier is precious, made a few gallons at a time by evaporators that also have to feed the boilers. So showers get rationed hard. A quick rinse, salt water first, and fresh water only at the very end. Just enough to cut the soap. 500 men share a handful of heads and sinks on any given deck. And during a battle, those men aren't showering at all. They're standing at general quarters in the same uniform for 2-3 days running, sweat-soaked, streaked with fuel oil from the men working below, and nobody says a word about it, because everybody smells exactly the same. On a ship this tight, misery that's shared stops registering as misery. It just becomes the air you breathe. And then there's the part no survey checklist ever plans for: the men who never come back up. Roughly 300 of Yorktown's crew are lost across the battle and the sinking that follows it. And every one of those names belonged to somebody who'd been eating a sandwich in that same passageway, sleeping 3 high in that same rack 12 hours earlier. The ship herself takes 3 bomb hits on June 4th, gets patched up fast enough to keep launching planes within the hour, only to take 2 torpedoes that same afternoon and go dead in the water. She doesn't sink that day. She sits there listing 26 degrees, powerless, most of her crew already ordered off, while a skeleton salvage party, close to 170 volunteers, climbs back aboard under Captain Buckmaster to try to save her. They work through the day rigging pumps, jettisoning anti-aircraft guns and aircraft to fight the list, trying to right a carrier with no power and a hole torn in her side. For a while, it almost works. It doesn't. A Japanese submarine finds the wounded ship under tow 2 days later and puts 2 more torpedoes into her hull. Yorktown rolls over and goes down on the morning of June 7th. Most of the roughly 2,000 men who'd been living in those cramped, overheated racks a week earlier are pulled out of the water by destroyers and cruisers nearby, exhausted, coated in fuel oil and alive. Not all of them. Here's the detail that actually stops people when they hear it for the first time. During those worst hours, sailors, sealed in those lower compartments, could not tell whether their own ship had won or lost. The first real word most of them got that Yorktown was going down came the same way every piece of news came down there. Second hand, from a man climbing down a ladder with his face already telling the story before he opened his mouth. Men who fought through history's most decisive naval battle spent most of it not knowing the score. That detail is the one letters home almost never captured. Because how do you explain to your mother that you were in a war and mostly just waiting in the dark? Think about that rotation for a second, the whole ladder stacked at once. Because that's what those last 3 days actually were. A rack too small to turn over in, inside a compartment too hot to properly sleep in, feeding a body running on cold sandwiches and almost no real rest, sealed behind a dogged hatch with no window and no way to know if the next shudder through the deck is a near miss or the one that gets you. That is the environment the United States Navy asked 19-year-olds to fight a decisive battle in. Not a cockpit with a view of the whole Pacific, a steel box, 4 decks down, with a stranger's warm rack waiting for the next shift, and a voice tube that might tell you anything at all. There's a quieter thread running under the whole ordeal too, and it's worth sitting with. Sailors who lived through this kind of stretch describe small, almost domestic rituals holding the whole compartment together. A man who saved half his coffee ration to trade for a dry pair of socks. A card game that ran for 6 hours because nobody could sleep anyway and nobody wanted to be alone with their own thoughts. A chief who cracked the same tired joke every time the lights flickered, not because it was funny anymore, but because hearing his voice meant the compartment was still there, still intact, still theirs. None of that shows up in a battle report. All of it is what actually got 500 strangers through 3 days sealed in the dark together. So what's the honest answer to how they survived it? Not toughness alone, and not training alone either, though both mattered plenty. It's that the man in the rack above you was breathing the same stale air, eating the same cold sandwich, and waiting on the same silence from the same voice tube. Discomfort shared by 500 people stops behaving like a hardship and starts behaving like a fact of the room. And a fact of the room is something you can live inside for 3 days if you absolutely have to. Yorktown's crew did. Not every one of them walked away from it, but the ship and the war she helped decide carried on because enough of them did. If you want to see what daily life looked like aboard the other carriers that fought at Midway, or follow the men who never made it home, that's exactly where this channel is headed next.